Hey folks, welcome back from your Thanksgiving breaks. We are now in the home stretch of this course, and this week you're going to get two short-ish lectures on the origins, conduct, and outcome of the Civil War. It's either going to be one long one or two short ones, and hey, let's do two short ones. So the Civil War, much like the Revolution before it, was ultimately a struggle over what kind of country the United States was to become, right? It was a military struggle, and we'll talk just a little bit about that in the next lecture. But ultimately, it's much more than that. It is essentially a question decided by arms over what kind of country this is to be, and sometimes referred to as the Second American Revolution. And the consequences of the Civil War, which is what we're going to talk about next week, were momentous. The victory of the North ended slavery and placed the United States firmly on the path of industrial capitalism and wage labor. It also resulted in the tremendous expansion of the federal government, as well as the extension of constitutional guarantees of citizenship and political equality to include Black Americans, at least in theory. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances around that question and what happened to the promises that were made in the aftermath of the Civil War next week. As we talk about the run up to the war and its conduct this week, it's worth keeping in mind the momentous stakes that rested on the outcome of this conflict. Not simply the fate of the Union, but the very nature, the fundamental fabric of American society, political, cultural, economic, was at stake in this conflict. Let me start with a very simple assertion. The Civil War was ultimately a conflict about slavery. Now that may seem on the surface fairly self-evident to you. I hope it does, because that would testify well to the schooling you've received thus far. But in fact, that position, that simple assertion that the Civil War was about slavery, has been assailed from all sides since the very first shot on Fort Sumter in April 1861. And you can watch innumerable movies or go to see reenactments or play video games or experience the Civil War on the History Channel or whatever, without ever grappling with the central cause of the war, which was the continued existence of the institution of African slavery in the American South. And normally when there are historiographical controversies, right? Historical graphical controversy is just a fancy way of saying historians arguing about things. I don't really get into them in great depth with you in this class, right? This is a survey class. We cover a lot of territory, and I will generally just give you either the dominant historical interpretation or my historical interpretation. In this case, though, because this notion that the Civil War was not about slavery is such a longstanding and widespread, in my view, myth, I think it's worth at least wrestling with that argument, explaining it to you, and explaining to you why I and most historians, the vast majority of American historians, think that's wrong. And in fact, the war was about slavery. So let's give you a version of the Civil War that was promoted at the time by the white South and remains in circulation, particularly in the South. And this argument is that the Civil War was not, in fact, about slavery. Rather, it was about states' rights, about protecting the sovereignty of the states of the South and their constituent citizens against arrogant and intrusive federal power. And in this version of the argument, the states of the South were essentially motivated by the same concerns over domineering centralized authority that had motivated the founding fathers back in 1776. Only in this case, it's Lincoln taking on the role of George III and the Union Army that of the Redcoats. Right? And as proof of this theory, as supposed proof of this theory, its defenders point to the fact that most of the soldiers, the vast majority of the soldiers of the Confederate Army, did not, in fact, own slaves. And this is true, right? We already talked about, on the eve of the Civil War, 3/4 of white Southerners don't own slaves at all. And the vast majority of the Confederate Army is made up of non-slaveholding Southerners. And the argument goes that, well, they didn't own slaves, so they couldn't have been fighting to defend slavery. They were fighting instead to defend their liberties, their homes, and their way of life against arrogant, tyrannical, and overbearing Yankees. To this day, you will hear some Southerners speak not of the Civil War, but they'll call it the War of Northern Aggression. My dad grew up in West Virginia. When he went to school, he was taught not about the Civil War. He didn't get lectures on the Civil War. He got lectures on the War of Northern Aggression, right? Pitting the South as defending its rights against a hostile federal government that was bent on oppressing them. Now, this idea that the Civil War was primarily about states' rights and not about slavery also actually has a Northern variant. In this explanation, the Civil War was also not about slavery, but rather about defending the integrity of the federal union, about protecting the integrity of the United States as a whole undivided nation. And those who advocate this position would note that Lincoln had actually never embraced abolitionism prior to taking office. And that's a fact that by 1860, Lincoln's Republican Party, abolitionism is not a controversial position anymore. And yet Lincoln himself was not an abolitionist, right? Well, we'll talk a little bit about his specific positions on slavery, but he did not take office in 1860 saying, "I've come to abolish slavery." He wanted to continue its expansion, but he was not an abolitionist when the war started. And in fact, it's not Lincoln who starts the war, as we'll see. It was only after the newly formed Confederacy directly fires on Union troops at Fort Sumter, that Lincoln reluctantly goes to war. Even then, his avowed goal when Lincoln goes to war is to restore the Union, not to end slavery. It's not until 1863, a year and a half after the start of the war, that Lincoln finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as you'll see in the next lecture, was itself a very cautious, conservative document that did not, in fact, liberate all slaves, but only those meeting a few select criteria. So, Lincoln's public statements and his conduct of the war would seem to support this argument, right? That that slavery was not the fundamental cause. That the fundamental cause for the North was about preserving the Union. And this is in some ways the kind of mirror image of the Southern position on this, right? That, not about slavery, it's about states' rights. And, there are elements of truth in both of these alternative explanations, right? Anything as complex and emotional as the Civil War is always going to generate a rich variety of opinions and motives, both in contemporary participants and in post facto observers like ourselves. And I do not doubt that there were white Southerners who picked up arms in the service of the Confederacy, who truly and sincerely believed that the war was about states' rights and protecting their personal liberty. And there were no doubt just as sincerely those in the North who didn't give a damn about slavery or about freeing Black people, but were anxious to volunteer to fight for the cause of the Union and to defeat the treasonous Southern rebels. Right? But without discounting the individual motives of partisans on either side, then or now, one of the jobs of the historian is to sort through all of these various explanations and to come up with our best judgment on the root causes of the conflict. It is my judgment, and ultimately the judgment of the vast majority of American historians, that the Civil War was ultimately, at its root, a war about the institution of slavery. So take the states' rights argument, for example, right? Again, let's sort of follow this through. We'll give this argument arguably, more respect than it deserves, but you will hear it, and so I want you to be familiar with it. It's absolutely true that the issue of states' rights versus federal power was a contentious one, and one that long predated the Civil War, right? In some ways, going back to the Constitutional Convention, the battle between Federalists and Anti-Federalists was in many ways a battle about states' rights versus the power of a strong central government. And even after the Constitution is adapted, the dispute between Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party and Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist power is in many ways a continuation of this struggle, right? With Hamilton and the Federalists being in favor of a strong, powerful central government, and Jefferson and his compatriots being in favor of a more devolved form of government that centers around states and localities. This is a real and genuine dispute. And it plays out. It plays out in the 1800s in a variety of ways. The first people to actually propose to consider secession from the Union, to say, hey, maybe states should leave the Union, were actually Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1778. They said, hey, the Federalists have gone too far. We should think about leaving this Union. We see it again in the late 1820s when South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun is so unhappy with a tariff, tax on imports, that's been adopted by the federal government that he suggests that states have the right to veto federal law. It's a doctrine called nullification. And it is absolutely true that commitment to the idea of states' rights was very deep in the South, both before and after the Civil War. So all of that part is true. But if we are actually being honest with each other here, ultimately, there was only one states' right that white Southerners were willing to commit treason and fight and die in order to defend. And that is the right to own Black people as property. We didn't have a civil war with 600,000 dead over a tariff or the Alien and Sedition Acts or any of the other innumerable disputes over states' rights, which were real. They have an intellectual base. They had material interests at play. None of those earlier disputes ever resulted in a civil war. White Southerners were not going to fight and die and commit treason to defend themselves against a tariff. It was only slavery. It is the one state's right that Southerners were willing ultimately to fight and die for. And the reason for that is relatively simple. On just about every other dispute over issues of states' rights, right? Federal and state power, right? They clash with each other. On every other dispute, it's possible to imagine a compromise, right? So, take the tariff, for example, right? Let's say the North wants to impose a $10 tariff on every load of machine goods that comes in from Great Britain. And the South says, we don't want any tariff, we want zero tariffs. Well, you can compromise on that, right? Well, how about a $5 tariff, right? No such compromise was possible on the issue of slavery. And Lincoln himself, I think, probably put this most eloquently in 1858 when he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it should become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. No compromise is possible on slavery. For Southern defenders of slavery, the only way to keep slavery secure, even in the South, is to ensure its legality everywhere. Because if the North were to ever, or any anti-slavery majority were ever to coalesce, the road to abolition, as Lincoln points out here, would be clear. There's simply no compromising on this issue. And at the end of the day, white Southerners, rather than give up slavery, decided they would commit treason against the Union and fight and die to defend their new slave nation. States' rights, sanctity of the Union, the Southern way of life, all of these are ultimately subsets of a larger debate over the future of slavery. To say the Civil War was about preserving the Union or about protecting states' rights confuses the kind of specific provocations or triggers with the root cause, and the root cause was ultimately slavery. And Southerners themselves, ironically, were actually quite honest about this when the time came to leave the Union. You know, when the story of the Civil War gets retold after the abolition of slavery, the Southerners will go back and say, oh no, it wasn't actually about slavery, it was about states' rights. Yada yada. We're not racist, right? They were very clear about this at the time, though, right? When Mississippi votes to secede the Union on January 9th, 1861, they make it quite clear why they're leaving in this momentous step which our state has taken of dissolving its connection with a government of which we so long formed a part. It is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. I'll let you read the whole quote. It's very clear that slavery is the bedrock of Southern culture, economy, and society, and that white Southerners will die rather than give it up. And it's also closely identified, inextricably identified, with explicit notions of white supremacy. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander H. Stephens, put it like this: our new government, he says, speaking of the Confederacy, is founded upon, its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Do you want to know why some people get upset about the Confederate flag? Do you want to know why I and many others think this flag should be permanently removed from public display? Oh, this is why, right? This is a flag that at its origins is linked not simply to slavery, but to white supremacy. And, if you take the second half of this course, you'll see that the Confederate flag, is hoisted down by force from Confederate state houses in 1865 at the conclusion of the war. It is not a coincidence that Southern states begin flying the Confederate flag again in the 1950s and 1960s as the civil rights movement takes off. This flag is an explicit symbol of white supremacy. It was always its intent. It remains its intent. It cannot be extracted from that context. So, I hope I've convinced you that the Civil War was about slavery. Again, you don't have to believe what I tell you, right? This course is not about you parroting back what I tell you. You are free-thinking individuals. You can come to your own conclusions. I think the evidence is pretty clear from the Confederates themselves that this was a war about slavery and white supremacy. And what I want to do now is step back a little bit and talk about the kind of 10 years or so leading up to the start of this war, how we get to the Civil War as a conflict. And then I'll break there, and then the next lecture we'll talk about the actual conduct of the war itself. So one of the enduring themes of this course is that victory in war often leads to unintended consequences for the victors, right? And so a great example of this is Great Britain in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, right? So 1763, Great Britain, with its American and Canadian allies, has won this great victory against France. They've consolidated control of almost half of the North American continent. And yet, 2 decades later, 1783, the tensions caused by that victory, right? And many of the tensions that led to the immediate triggers of the American Revolution are directly related to Britain's attempts to kind of rationalize and control its newly won empire. Those tensions result in a revolution that ultimately results in American independence and the loss of vast chunks of this territory, right? So victory in war against France produces a series of tensions that ultimately lead to revolution and a British defeat in the Revolutionary War. Something similar is at play in the United States starting in the 1840s, right? And in our last lecture before the break, I talked about this notion of manifest destiny, this combination of sort of land-hungry white settlers tied to a kind of messianic religious belief that God had allotted this continent for white Americans in particular. So a combination of not just a material desire for more land, although that is actually a very big part of it, but also a kind of religious and ethnic and racial sense of superiority leads Americans to continue, white Americans to continue spreading west, right? And so James K. Polk triples the United States during the size of his presidency. We ended with the war against Mexico last time. The occupation of Mexico City, Nicholas Trist. I don't know why I have this slide here, except I like looking at Nicholas Trist. Those of you who have a class with David Torres Roof, check it out, right? Not entirely dissimilar. Go take a class with David if you don't know what I'm talking about. So for the purposes of this lecture, the significance here is what you see and what I ended with last time, which is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February of 1848. And the United States adds 500,000 miles of formerly Mexican territory to the nation. That includes California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and parts of California. Much like the British in 1763, however, all of this new territory comes with a set of problems. And I already mentioned for you the struggles of the former residents of Mexico in the Southwest who wake up one morning to find themselves American citizens, or not necessarily American citizens, as the case may be, and have to defend their lands and their rights against this new government. It also creates problems for the government of the United States, because what are you going to do with all of this new territory? And specifically, will all of this new territory be slave territory, meaning territory or states in which slavery is allowed, or will it be free? Would slavery be prohibited? And this is really significant, not just for the people who live in these territories, but for the balance of power in the United States, right? With each of these new territories comes a number of representatives once they're admitted as states, and 2 senators. If all of them are made into free states, then that tips the balance in favor of the free states in the North. And again, as Lincoln says, potentially puts us on the road to the abolition of slavery. Meanwhile, if they all enter as slave states, it cements the status of slavery, not just in the South, but again, Southerners, white Southerners, are not going to feel confident until slavery is the law of the land everywhere. So this poses a challenge or a question, not simply for those who live in these new states as they are admitted, but also for the political future of the Union and the future of slavery. So out of this, we get a compromise, right? We're not at a point yet where either of the partisans, North or South, are ready to go to war over the future of slavery. And we get a temporary compromise that buys some time. So California is allowed to enter the Union as a free state, as was Oregon, and the unorganized territory up there in the North. Utah and New Mexico are opened to the possibility of slavery by what's called popular sovereignty, meaning that the people of those states will vote, the white people of those states will vote themselves and decide whether they're going to allow slavery or not. However, in return for allowing California to enter the Union as a free state, the South insists upon another concession. And they specifically insist upon something called the Fugitive Slave Act. What this act does is it authorizes federal marshals to assist masters in recapturing enslaved people who make it out of the South into free states in the North. It denied jury trials to alleged fugitives. So if you were an enslaved person and you escaped, and your master could go to the federal marshals, go to the federal government and says, this is my former slave, go get them. The federal marshal would be dispatched, and if they found him or her or someone who even looked like them, they would just say, okay, you're coming with us. There's no trial. There's no opportunity for this person to defend themselves. This person would simply be dragged back to the plantation and returned to slavery. And the Fugitive Slave Act applies everywhere, all across the country, even in free states. So let's say you manage to escape from the deep South, from way down in South Carolina or Louisiana. You make it all the way to Boston, which is the absolute cradle of abolitionism, the most radical abolitionist city, arguably in the United States. Federal marshals could track you down there, find you, arrest you, and haul you back down to South Carolina without so much as a jury trial. The effect of this is not only to make it harder for enslaved people to escape, because even if they made it to free territory, it doesn't mean they were safe. They had to be constantly looking over their shoulders for federal marshals everywhere they went. It also has the effect of radicalizing Northern public opinion on this issue. Up to the 1850s or so, abolitionism remained really a minority position even in the North, right? Many Northerners didn't like slavery. They weren't, they didn't want to have slavery where they lived. But they sort of, the common attitude was like, okay, let the Southerners do what they want to do, right? Whatever. Like, that's not for us, but far be it from us to go impose ourselves upon them. They can have slavery in the South. We will not have it here, right? And for white Northerners, slavery doesn't affect them personally, except to the point that it may slightly enrich them, given the intricate connections between the economy of the North and the South. But it's easy for white Northerners to kind of just look the other way, right? Because they don't see the brutality of slavery on a daily basis. Well, once this act passes, suddenly it means that the long arm of slave power is extending and reaching into northern cities. And it makes it harder for Northerners to ignore slavery. When federal marshals are kicking down the doors of churches and people's homes because there's a suspected enslaved person who's hiding there, right? And churches were a popular place for enslaved folks to hide. There were oftentimes stops on the Underground Railroad. And so you have these federal marshals coming to churches in the North, busting down the doors and hauling people out, right? This leads many Northerners to say, okay, you know what? Actually, slavery does affect us. And it produces a series of conflicts in the streets of northern cities. February of 1851, for example, just a month after the law goes into effect, a fugitive slave is taken to a courtroom in Boston, and a group of white abolitionists joined by black abolitionists storm the courtroom themselves and forcibly remove that enslaved person from the courtroom and hide them again. In Oberlin, Ohio in 1858, a biracial group of college professors, students, and former fugitive slaves also stage a rescue of a fugitive slave who's about to be taken back to the South. These acts of resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, no, you are not taking these people back. This is our state, our city, our town, our church, our college, and you are not, your slave power is not going to change how we run our affairs. That kind of grassroots resistance were precursors to the kind of direct action and violence that we'll see increase in the run-up to the Civil War, culminating in John Brown's raid. The end of the lecture today. And this increasing tension and violence is actually not confined to the streets of American cities. And in fact, it spilled over in 1856 into the United States Senate, the self-proclaimed world's greatest deliberative body. And the roots of this clash in May of 1856 begin with this guy, Charles Sumner. He's a Massachusetts senator. Again, New England is really the sort of center of abolitionist sentiment. And he is giving a speech. He gives a speech in May of 1856 on the issue of Kansas. So Kansas is a Midwestern state that's about to be admitted to the Union, and there's this great dispute, as there is in all these other states that are going to be admitted, about whether it will enter as a free or a slave state. Sumner gives a speech in which he accuses two of his colleagues, Stephen Douglas and Andrew Butler, of conspiring in a criminal fashion to admit Kansas as a slave state. He characterizes Douglas, so you see there on your left, as, quote, a noisome, squat, and nameless animal, not a proper set model for an American senator. Andrew Butler was not there in person, but he said of the senator from South Carolina that he has, quote, a mistress who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery. These are relatively mild things by our standards today. But Butler's relative is his cousin, Preston Brooks, who served in the House of Representatives from South Carolina, was offended on behalf of his kinsman, Andrew Butler, and decides to defend the honor of his relative. So a couple days after Sumner gives this speech, Brooks walks over from the House of Representatives into the Senate chamber. He's carrying with him a cane, a light cane, a wooden stick. He walks over to where Charles Sumner is sitting quietly at his desk doing his Senate business, and he just starts wailing on him with a cane. Sumner is completely surprised, shocked. He falls to the ground, bleeding. He tries to cover himself with his desk. After a very long minute, it's over. Sumner is lying, bleeding on the floor, and Preston Brooks sheaths his walking stick and calmly walks out, and nobody stops him. Overnight, both of these men become heroes in their respective parts of the country. Sumner is seen as an abolitionist martyr. He recovers from his injuries. He's actually very badly injured. It takes him quite some time, but he recovers from his injuries and returns to serve in the U.S. Senate. Preston Brooks, meanwhile, becomes a hero in the South for standing up to what are seen as abolitionist bullies in the North. He's actually reelected. He's not disciplined. I mean, he is literally caned almost to the point of unconsciousness, a United States senator. He faces no discipline, and he's in fact reelected the next year to another term in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is a dramatic moment, an escalation in the intersectional tensions over slavery. Remember we had a kind of another incident like this back in 1798. It's kind of funny, right? Like these two dudes fighting each other and everyone's looking on going, it's a good laugh, right? This is not so funny. Not only because it isn't a fair fight, but because what this represents is the increasingly irreconcilable tensions between North and South, between two regions of the country over this issue of slavery. Tensions that increasingly appears will only be resolvable through violence. The United States House of Representatives responded to this violence by adopting a so-called gag rule that automatically tabled or rejected any abolitionist petitions that came to that body, essentially trying to say, well, we'll avoid any violence on this issue by not talking about slavery. Ultimately, though, it's simply too late by the 1850s to prevent the issue of slavery from tearing apart the American political system and ultimately the Union itself. You'll recall that ever since the era of Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 1830s, the two major political parties, the Democrats, with the party of Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs, in many ways heirs to the Federalists and opposed to Jackson, had essentially attempted to keep the issue of slavery out of American politics. They fought bitterly on many, many other issues. But the idea was to simply keep this issue out of the realm of politics in order to avoid tearing apart these parties and the Union itself. By the mid-1850s, however, slavery can no longer be contained. It toppled the second party system. By the mid-1850s, the Whigs have dissolved and essentially have become two parties, right? They become Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, with the Southern Whigs supporting slavery. And the Democrats, meanwhile, become essentially a regional Southern party. And eventually the Southern Whigs are essentially absorbed into the Democratic Party. Several new parties attempted to step into the vacuum left by the disappearance of the Whigs, the most successful of which was the Republican Party. Republicans are, like the Democrats of this period, a regional party with their strength in the North and to some extent in the West. When they're founded in the 1850s, the Republican Party does not necessarily begin as abolitionist. There are some abolitionists in the Republican Party. That position gradually gains in popularity till the 1860s or so. But the most sort of common ground that Republicans can agree on in the 1850s. It's what's called the free soil movement. And the idea is, okay, we're not necessarily going to abolish slavery in the places where it exists, but we do insist that as this nation expands and as it adds new states and territories, that all of those be so-called free soil, meaning slavery is not allowed in them. By 1856, the United States is divided politically between two regional parties, the Republicans in the North, the Democrats in the South, both of which believed the other was out to crush them. With tensions running this high, both politically and in the streets of American cities, it's not going to take much to tip this political fight over into a full-fledged civil war. And arguably the final push, the instigating event that leads these tensions into outright war comes from this guy, John Brown. Also with kind of rocking a David Torres roof beard here. So, depending on who you talk to, John Brown was either a modern American saint dedicated to justice and racial equality, or alternatively, a murderous madman out to destroy America. And, arguably both descriptions are true in their own way. Prior to the 1850s, prior to growing the crazy guy beard, Brown had been something of a drifter, right? He had failed at just about everything he tried in life, which included stints as a farmer, a wool merchant, a tanner, and a land speculator. He declared bankruptcy multiple times by age 40 and was oftentimes on the run from his many creditors. He was also probably a little bit insane. And I say that not simply because his grandmother, his mother, 5 of his aunts and uncles, and 2 of his 20 children were declared to be certifiably insane. But also because in May of 1856, he and his followers hacked 5 men to death with broadswords in Kansas during the struggle over slavery in that territory. Now, violence is not uncommon on the American frontier. Violence is not uncommon in the struggle over slavery. Violence is endemic to slavery. But hacking 5 dudes to death with a broadsword was a bit extreme, even by the standards of the day. So, it is possible that Brown was maybe a little bit crazy. But his madness, such as it was directed towards a cause that would help change the history of this country. Brown was born into a family that was both deeply religious and strongly opposed to slavery. He drank deeply of both of these beliefs, and by the 1840s, he had decided to devote his considerable energies to the abolitionist cause. What separated Brown from other abolitionists, though, was that he was not content to simply publish pamphlets or newspapers or give speeches condemning slavery. Those themselves were actually dangerous activities in the 1840s. Being an abolitionist could make you just giving a speech on abolitionism could make you a target. Brown, however, believes that slavery is a sin, it's immoral, and it is the absolute duty of all self-professed Christians to take any means necessary to abolish it. It was part of this quest to end slavery that Brown traveled to Kansas in the 1850s. Kansas had become a kind of proxy battleground for slavery as the pro and anti-slavery forces in that state fought with each other to determine whether it would be admitted as a free or a slave state. After 5 anti-slavery activists were killed, Brown takes it upon himself to avenge their death, and in the course of doing this, that he hacks 5 pro-slavery men to death with a broadsword. This particularly dramatic set of murders in support of abolitionism gained him some local notoriety, and he was forced to flee Kansas. This is only the beginning of his war, however. He wanted to bring down the entire institution of slavery. And to that end, he planned a raid that he believed would touch off a slave rebellion that would spread all across the South and extinguish slavery from the United States. On October 16th, 1859, John Brown and 21 of his followers, which included a kind of mixed race group of white and black folks, staged a raid on a place called Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Harper's Ferry was the site of an armory where a number of guns and ammunition was stored. And Brown's plan is to seize those guns and that ammunition and then rally the enslaved people of Virginia to his cause. And this would be the spark that would touch off a slave rebellion that would spread across the South. The first part of this plan actually goes pretty well. Brown and his men did seize the armory. After that, however, pretty much nothing went right. The whole plan hinged on convincing enslaved people in Virginia and Harper's Ferry and then beyond to join his cause as soon as he had seized the armory, right? Brown and 21 dudes are not going to end slavery by themselves. However, given the dispersed nature of the plantation South, that was really never a realistic plan, right? Part of the reason the South is structured the way it is with these dispersed plantations and then patrols, slave patrols, in many ways the nucleus of the modern police force in between them, is to prevent things like this from happening, to prevent word from traveling from plantation to plantation, and to certainly prevent any kind of organizing among and across plantations. So most enslaved people in Virginia never even knew this happened. They had no idea that John Brown had staged this raid. And even if they had, most of them are wise enough to not throw in their lot and risk their lives for this dude and 21 of his followers, right? So there is no slave rebellion. 2 days after the siege starts, federal troops led by an army commander, a then U.S. Army commander named Robert E. Lee, arrive in Virginia and they capture John Brown and his men. John Brown is tried, convicted, and condemned to death by a Virginia court. And yet, in death, Brown achieved a level of success that he had never enjoyed in his lifetime. As he stood before the jury, who announced his sentence in 1859, he declared, "Now, if it be deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." These words and the stoic way he conducted himself right up through his execution by hanging transformed Brown in the eyes of many Northerners from a deranged madman into a martyr for the cause of freedom. Though many Northerners continued to disapprove of Brown's methods, his words and his actions helped further focus Northern attentions on the evil of slavery and pushed many over into the abolitionist camp. William Lloyd Garrison, who I mentioned several lectures ago as a prominent white Northern abolitionist, declared, "In firing his gun, John Brown has merely told what time of day it is. It is high noon, thank God." The abolitionist Frederick Douglass later declared, "Did John Brown fail? John Brown began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic." He went on to say, "His zeal in the cause of freedom was infinitely superior to mine. Mine was as the taper light. His was as the burning sun. I could live for the slave. John Brown could die." So in the North, Brown and his martyrdom helped catalyze the issue of abolitionism and transform it into maybe still not a majority sentiment, but certainly a much more powerful and widely shared sentiment in the North. Southerners, meanwhile, are absolutely terrified by John Brown's raid, as well as by the reaction to it in the North. White Southerners had long been paranoid about the possibility of slave insurrections. And now they feared that Northerners like Brown are going to continue to slip across the southern border in an attempt to start similar sorts of rebellions. In response, the states of the South began organizing militarily to defend against such incursions, training and drilling militias that would later provide the backbone of what would become the Confederate Army. Increasingly, the South becomes a paranoid armed camp, terrified that Northern abolitionists were plotting to take away their enslaved people. It was in this superheated atmosphere that we have the election of 1860, and more precisely, the election of this kind of awkward, gangly dude that brought about the final crisis leading to war. Now, Lincoln and his position on slavery and on civil rights is somewhat complicated. On the one hand, Lincoln was a member of the Republican Party, and he believed, as he said in 1858, slavery is an unqualified evil to the Negro, to the white man, to the soil, and to the state. He's firmly anti-slavery. He was not, however, in 1860, and did not run upon in 1860 a supporter of abolition, not an abolitionist. And his attitudes towards civil rights were not exactly progressive, right? He says again in 1858, I am not, nor have ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. For the Republican Party, which nurtures an increasingly large number of abolitionists, Lincoln is a moderate. He wants to end the further spread of slavery, right? Again, this sort of free soil position that any new territory brought into the Union should be free territory. But he does not run for election on an abolitionist platform. And he comes into office saying, hey, look, I'm not going to come take anyone's slaves away. I will try to halt the further expansion of slavery, but I'm not going to take anyone's slaves away. But in the kind of supercharged and politicized atmosphere of 1860, calling even for the limitation of slavery is bound to inflame the South. Southerners believed that if slavery were not allowed to expand, that over time, the North would increasingly gain political power as the non-slave states entered the Union. Lincoln himself had said as much, right, in that House Divided speech. Once the North had secured the balance of power in Congress, abolitionists would then move to outlaw slavery everywhere, right? Even if Lincoln himself was not an abolitionist, should he stop the further expansion of slavery, eventually abolitionists would gain a majority. This was a scenario that haunted the white South and made them terrified of even a relative moderate free soil Republican like Lincoln. So as you can see, the election of 1860 broke down just precisely along sectional lines, right? The South votes for the Democrats, the North votes for Lincoln. The border states are voting for this kind of compromise candidate, a guy named Bell. Lincoln takes office, again, saying, I don't want a war, I don't want to fight anybody, but the South has seen enough. Rather than risk having their human property confiscated now or at any time in the future, white Southerners concluded that the time had come with the election of Lincoln to leave the Union. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina called a special convention, which voted to secede from the Union. And by February of 1861, 6 other states of the Lower South followed. Lincoln still, even at this late date, even after they had declared these states and said, hey, we're not part of the Union anymore, Lincoln did not act militarily, did not initiate preparations for war, and pleaded with these states to return to the Union. That decision is taken out of his hands, however. On the night of April 12, 1861, the South Carolina militia fired on Fort Sumter, which is a federal base that's inside South Carolina. It's this island kind of military base. And they had given the federal troops an ultimatum to leave, saying this is not, you don't belong here anymore. The troops had stayed, and the Confederacy fires the first shots of the war on April 12th, 1861. And it is this moment that finally initiates the Civil War. The poet Walt Whitman put it like this: all the past we leave behind. And I'll break this lecture here. And then in the next lecture, which will get posted tomorrow in all likelihood, I'll talk about the conduct and the outcome of the war. See you then.